Early Islamic texts emphasized individual accountability, conscious intention, and a pronounced fear of religious hypocrisy. The primary focus was on the internal state of a believer, ensuring that outward actions were matched by inner conviction rather than on achieving mystical experiences or altered states of consciousness. This emphasis stemmed from repeated Quranic warnings against performing religious duties without genuine sincerity. Outward obedience was considered insufficient if it lacked a foundation of inner piety and God consciousness, highlighting a potential disconnect between public behavior and private belief that was a central concern. This is understanding holy systems, where we examine religions through their texts, historical transmission, and internal structure, without belief or judgment. Ascetic tendencies began to emerge within early Muslim society, often as a direct reaction to the expanding empire's growing wealth and political consolidation. Some individuals viewed this material prosperity and worldly power as a potential spiritual corruption, a deviation from the simpler life of the early community. These early practitioners concentrated on rigorous self-discipline, material restraint, and constant moral vigilance. Their path was not defined by specific rituals, elaborate symbols, or ecstatic practices, but rather by a commitment to controlling personal desires and maintaining a state of ethical purity and watchfulness. Such individuals were primarily known for their exemplary conduct and upright character, not for articulating complex doctrines or making public spiritual claims. Their reputation was built on observable piety, humility, and a strict adherence to moral principles, which served as a model for others in the community. Over time, a specialized vocabulary developed to articulate and analyze inner psychological and spiritual states. This language was created to describe concepts like sincere intention, humility before God, and the continuous internal struggle against the ego, providing a framework for discussing the inner life. Terms such as nafs, representing the ego or lower self, qalb, for the spiritual heart, and ihsan, the concept of perfecting one's worship, became analytical tools. They were employed to explain and guide the systematic process of inner moral and spiritual work required of a believer. This developing vocabulary was intended to clarify and support the discipline of self-purification, not to function as a replacement for or an alternative to established Islamic law, Sharia. It was seen as a method for perfecting one's adherence to the law, not transcending it. As this field of knowledge grew, teachers began to formalize spiritual instruction, primarily through close personal mentorship and leading by example. This direct relationship between teacher and student was considered essential for transmitting the subtle aspects of inner discipline and ensuring proper guidance. This master-disciple model led to the formation of chains of transmission, or silsila, which documented the lineage of teachers back to the early community. These chains were established to preserve the authenticity of the methods being taught and to maintain a system of accountability for both instructors and students. Subsequently, written manuals and treatises started to appear, aiming to codify and define acceptable spiritual practices within the established boundaries of Islamic orthodoxy. These texts served as guides to ensure that the pursuit of inner purification remained aligned with scriptural and legal principles. These early texts predominantly emphasized core Islamic tenets such as obedience to God, adherence to religious law, strict personal ethics, and the importance of consistent repentance. The pursuit of extraordinary spiritual experiences or mystical states was deliberately de-emphasized in favor of foundational moral discipline. This process of formalization gradually transformed the approach from an informal personal struggle for piety into what would later be recognized as Sufism, a structured path with established methodologies. This shift marked the beginning of its development as a distinct discipline within the broader Islamic tradition. However, as Sufi concepts and terminology spread, public misunderstanding grew, especially when its symbolic language was encountered by those outside of trained circles. The nuanced meanings intended for initiates were often interpreted literally or out of context by a wider, uninitiated audience. The use of evocative poetry and complex metaphors increasingly came to define Sufism in the popular imagination, sometimes replacing the original emphasis on disciplined instruction and sober self-examination. The aesthetic and emotional appeal of this literature overshadowed its rigorous ethical underpinnings for many. Consequently, profound statements about divine union or spiritual proximity were often detached from their original ethical and methodological context. Without the framework of disciplined practice and legal adherence, these expressions could be misinterpreted as claims of divinity or antinomianism, a rejection of religious law. In response to these developments, some mainstream religious scholars actively defended Sufism, framing it as a form of inner jurisprudence, fiqh al-batin. They argued that its true purpose was to perfect the internal aspects of worship, making it a legitimate and essential dimension of Islam. Conversely, other prominent scholars began to reject later expressions of Sufism, which they viewed as excessive, misleading, or deviation from authentic Islamic practice. They criticized what they saw as the introduction of un-Islamic innovations, bid'ah, and the potential for doctrinal error. The dynamic was further complicated by political patronage, which elevated certain Sufi figures and their specific practices into grand public spectacles. Rulers and elites often sponsored Sufi lodges and festivals, integrating them into the fabric of state power and public life for various political ends. This patronage and institutionalization led to the formation of organized Sufi orders, or tariqas, each with its own specific structure, hierarchy, and set of rituals. This transformed how Sufism was perceived socially, shifting it from a personal inclination to a visible, institutionalized movement. As a result, the original focus on inner accountability and quiet self-rectification became increasingly overshadowed by external markers of affiliation. Membership in an order, veneration of saints, and participation in public rituals sometimes became more prominent than the internal struggle against the ego. This shift prompted critics to increasingly associate the term Sufism with what they considered to be dangerous innovations and deviations from the pristine faith, rather than with the original model of rigorous self-discipline. The external manifestations began to define the entire tradition in their eyes. Defenders of the tradition countered these criticisms by arguing that the distortions and excesses of some later manifestations did not invalidate the origins of the practice. They made a clear distinction between the foundational principles of early ascetics and later cultural or institutional accretions. A careful examination of the historical record reveals the existence of multiple, diverse Sufisms rather than a single, monolithic, and unified tradition. Different historical periods, regions, and social contexts produced a wide variety of practices and doctrines, all placed under the same general label. Therefore, a nuanced understanding of Sufism requires a critical separation of its earliest form, a discipline focused on intention and moral accountability, from the many later cultural, institutional, and philosophical layers that were added over centuries of its complex and varied development.